Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. We're bringing you the latest news and analysis from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Yin Khvat. Here's what's coming up.
中共的所作所为，其实是再次凸显了用武力解决分歧、破坏区域和平稳定的这样一种心态。
As Washington expands military support for Taiwan, are China's mass Air Force drills a warning against so-called US-Taiwan provocations, or just more evidence of the aggression the US is responding to? Then,
没有人要战争，台湾的政府与人民是如此，国际社会也是如此。但是各位国人同胞，和平不会从天而降。
in the face of China's threats, Taiwan's president announces an extension to the country's compulsory military service, a move perhaps too unpopular before the war in Ukraine. Also,
будемо відзначати свої свята, як завжди. Ми будемо посміхатись і радіти, як завжди. Відмінність одна – ми не будемо чекати дива, адже творимо його самі.
the uplifting influence of Ukraine's president, fresh back from a trip addressing US Congress. We analyse the support given to Ukraine compared with Taiwan. Plus,
you can look through the history of Portuguese, Dutch, and Japanese presence, particularly Japanese colonialism from 1895 to 1945. You can look back to the time of Kashinga or Zhengchenggong, which was separately ruled, and all of that sort of pushes back against the Chinese claim.
Jacques Delisle explains why China is looking away from history and why it must repeat that Taiwan has always been part of it. Welcome to the show. I'm Yin Khvat. Our guests today are Kitsch Liao, Atlantic Council's Global China Hub Assistant Director and also Taiwan's Doublethink Lab Military Affairs Consultant. He's a former Taiwan's Institute of National Defense and Security Research Analyst and a former Australian Strategic Policy Institute Consultant. And Wen Song, Australian National University's Australian Centre on China in the World lecturer. He is an expert on Taiwan-US-China affairs. And earlier I spoke to Jacques Delisle. Jacques is the University of Pennsylvania's Stephen A. Cousin Professor of Law and Political Science Professor. He is also the university's Centre for the Study of Contemporary China Director and its Centre for Asian Law Co-Director. Jacques is also currently the Asia Programme Director at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Kitsch, Wen, very warm welcome to the show today. We begin the show with China's Christmas Day incursion, labelled by both Taiwan and the US as destabilising to regional peace. This report by Jaime Ocon, Rick Laut and Howard Zhang.
China's increased military activity has put the spotlight on how prepared Taiwan is in the case of a Chinese invasion. President Tsai Ing-wen is set to chair a high-level national security meeting on Tuesday to discuss the country's civil defense. She is expected to announce a long-mooted extension to conscription, raising compulsory service from the current 4 months to 1 year. It's a move analysts say is needed to convince Washington that a commitment to Taiwan's defense is worthwhile.
我的观察是第一个，自由不是一个免费的午餐，所以台湾会愿意付出这样的一个军事的一个负担，来保护自己，也保护我们盟友的这个。
Chinese military activity around Taiwan has become a new normal over the past few years as Beijing flexes its muscles. But today's record report is a reminder that the threat is anything but normal. Howard Zhang, Rick Lauert, and Jaime Ocon for Taiwan Plus.
That report by Jaime Ocon, Rick Laut and Howard Zhang. Kitsch, let me start with you. So the 71 incursions into Taiwan's air defense zone, this was retaliation for American support in the national defense bill that was passed by Biden. The PLA says it's an escalation of collusion between Taiwan and the United States. What do you think of this position?
I believe this is very typical of what the PLA and the PRC by extension likes to do. They like to basically change the goalpost. They like to push the responsibility to Taiwan for changing the status quo. But as been made very clear, again, by the Taiwan Relations Act, which says, like in the U.S. understanding of things, as long as Taiwan maintains the status quo, the U.S. basically has the responsibility to provide Taiwan with sufficient military and defense capabilities to defend itself.
Let me bring in Wunti. Wunti, who is changing the status quo? According to China, it's the US and Taiwan. According to Taiwan and the US, it's China, especially when you look at the level of threat after Nancy Pelosi's visit in August.
I would say that if I had to choose, then I think Beijing probably bears a much greater share of the responsibility here in terms of changing the status quo. Obviously, both sides have their legitimate needs in terms of military defense modernization, in terms of building out a level of defense capability that they see as commensurate with their security needs. However, that's only capability. Then there's also the factor of intention. And in terms of intention here, what we have been seeing, especially after Nancy Pelosi's visit, is that Chinese sides have been challenging a number of things that used to be considered legitimate compromises between Taiwan and Beijing.
You talked about the median line, perhaps?
Indeed, the median line in terms of increasing violation of Taiwan's ADIZ, that's Air Defense Identification Zone. So these are the kind of moves that gradually chip away at what used to be the kind of what's reasonable compromise that sustain the status quo. So in this sense, I think Beijing has posed a much greater threat to upsetting the status quo than other actors.
Kitsch, because I mean, let's talk about August and let's talk about Christmas Day. So in August, it was what people were saying as de facto blockade, not quite a blockade, but encircling Taiwan. And then on Christmas Day, there was 71, a record number of airplanes. How significant was, that show of force?
So basically, like, this is what they're closing to what we call a strike package. Basically, in order to conduct, a bombing run, a mission against any military installations or even incursion into Taiwan, you need several different kinds of planes. You need EW airplanes, you need AWACS, you need, SEAD, suppression of enemy air defenses, and then you need people to carry bombs, and you need air superiority escort. So basically, like, we're talking about 40, 50 fighter jets of different kinds with supporting planes to conduct such a package. And they don't happen, just organically, right? You have to actually coordinate with each other. You have to make sure you have the timetables down. And this is actually what they're doing right now, right? It's not just like, to basically like to put pressure on the Taiwanese military, but also to exercise among themselves, to increase confidence, to increase capability. People have to do it before they understand, yeah, I'm capable of doing it.
Yeah, so it's that joint command that people will say are lacking for the PLA.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like that's not just a PLA problem, it's also a US problem and a Taiwanese problem. But one could say, like, when PLA does not talk about it, like, they never talk about this, right? They basically pretend like we're all good and like there's problems. So this is also an opportunity for us to actually take a look at what the Chinese are doing and see like what sort of capabilities they currently possess.
Wunti, are they in effect a false flag? These events like Nancy Pelosi, like the NDAA, just an excuse for China to exercise, to practice?
To a certain extent, I'll say yes. I mean, obviously, China has their own stated goals, be it the 2027 centenary of the PLA's founding, be it 2049, the so-called great rejuvenation of a Chinese nation. So I think the Chinese administration has strong pressure domestically, politically, in terms of being seen as making progress towards both showing itself as a military superpower, as well as, quote-unquote, making progress on the Taiwan issue. So in that sense, some kind of preparation in terms of gradually chipping away at the status quo, in terms of finding new room for military maneuvers for PLA, these are kind of expected anyway. So in that sense, all these other events we've been witnessing, e.g. Pelosi's visit, kind of provide one would say, a justification for them, in a sense that they use to justify their act of gray zone warfare or brinkmanship as an act of, quote-unquote, legitimate self-defense.
And Kitsch, do you think there was any significance in the drills starting on Christmas Day?
I would say, like, basically this is a coincidence because I do not believe PRC observes Christmas Day as we do or as the US does.
Is it not for a message for the US?
It is definitely a message, and like I would like to harken back to like basically the Christmas the Christmas offensive during the Vietnam War. That was actually that was the first thing that pops into my head when they talked about like the unprecedented incursion, and I think that's that's one of those psychological scars that they would try to exploit to some extent. Yeah.
Thank you. Still to come in the show, Volodymyr Zelensky's high-risk visit to Washington, D.C. to appeal for continued bipartisan support as Republicans are poised to take the House of Representatives.
Your money is not charity. It's an investment in the global security and democracy that we handle in the most responsible way.
But first, President Tsai Ing-wen has announced that Taiwan will extend its compulsory military service from the current 4 months to 1 year starting in 2024 due to the rising threat from the People's Republic of China. This report by Jaime Ocon and Klein Wang.
These men are Taiwan's front line of defense. They're tasked with protecting the country's sovereignty. Despite Taiwan having a democratically elected government, China, which lies just 160 kilometers from Taiwan's main island, has been ramping up its military pressure. It has vowed to take Taiwan under its control, by force if necessary. In response, the island nation has been enhancing its combat readiness and preparing its soldiers. Now Taiwan's government has announced that mandatory military service for men over 18 will be extended from 4 months to 1 year in order to better train and prepare its troops.
因为一般来讲，我们在讲 Army System， 第一个 part 是 Active Army， 第二个是 Reserve Army， 那第三个可能是 Civil Defense。那你这个 Conscription 就是会补充到 Active。
Extending the length of conscription is the latest in a series of moves designed to bolster Taiwan's defenses against the much larger and better equipped China. In terms of military funding, China spends almost 17 times more than Taiwan. And when it comes to troop numbers, China's active force of 2 million far outnumbers the island nation's force of 170,000. Analysts say that in order to counter such a large force, Taiwan needs to double down on the training of its soldiers and make sure they are prepared to handle any potential threat.
The quality of the soldiers is very important because right now the PLA can suddenly strike any place, any time as they choose. But our armed forces is very limited. So if they attack any places that the armed forces didn't have sufficient soldier to defend, they will achieve their goal very easily than ever.
Taiwan has recently begun emphasizing a strategy of asymmetric defense. This means buying smaller, cheaper weapons like anti-air and anti-ship missiles that can help close the gap with China's better equipped forces. Conscription may help bolster Taiwan's military manpower, but experts say it's just one of the steps needed to shore up the country's defenses. If Taiwan carries out its plan, its smaller military may just be able to hold off its far larger opponent. Klein Wang and Jaime Ocon for Taiwan Plus.
That report by Jaime Ocon and Klein Wang. Now, President Tsai Ing-wen said that conscripts will undergo more intense training, including shooting exercises, combat instruction used by U.S. forces, and they will operate more powerful weapons, including Stinger anti-aircraft missiles and anti-tank missiles. They will also be tasked with guarding key infrastructure, enabling regular forces to respond more swiftly to any Chinese attack. Kitsch, if I can start with you again. Would this sort of extension to 1 year, would this have been possible pre the Ukraine war?
Definitely no, because in order to extend basically the conscription, it depends on how much people are thinking, like, how much effort am I willing to actually spend on this? Now, the other part of this is people's willingness changes because of the war, but also like their understanding of how much the government is actually serious about this. A lot of the conscripts, when they did their service, including me, when we did our service, we feel like we wasted a lot of our time doing things that has nothing to do with combat capability. Now that may be a bureaucratic hurdles and limitations on basically what sort of training and what sort of understanding they could impart on your conscripts, right? But like right now, that's the energy that people got. That's the willingness, and we need to actually and that's what they're taking advantage of in order to actually establish this new conscription system.
And Wonti, how do you think it sits within the sort of regional or global norms? We've got, South Korea on 18 months and maybe above. Vietnam has 24 months. China, it's de jure. So under law, they do have conscription, but actually it's not practiced because they have enough volunteers. So how do you see, 12 months for Taiwan?
I would say that's probably a good starting point for Taiwan. I mean, obviously for Taiwan, it used to be 4 months, now they're making it 1 year. I think everything has to start from somewhere, and this is probably at this moment a politically feasible compromise point to start from. And I think because obviously length of service is one thing, but there's another thing in terms of making serving in the military be perceived by the society as an honorable pursuit. And on that issue, I think Taiwan may still have some more way to go in a sense. So for example, if you're in the US, for example, if you are an active duty soldier or if you are recognized as a veteran, for example, it's not uncommon that you will come across people on the street telling you, thank you for your service. Perhaps when it comes to submitting bids for government contracts, for example, some of them may have some degree of priority treatment. Things like that, that's manifesting both sort of financial rewards as well as a social status reward for having served in the military. And that's why it brings a certain culture that's more conducive to a longer military service as well. And I think Taiwan is making up room on that.
Right. Kitsch, before we get into the detail, one more question. Can we compare the domestic political costs of doing this versus the international gains, which Wonti touched on? President Tsai Ing-wen, in her announcement, said that this was a very difficult decision.
I agree. This is an extremely difficult decision. And one of the major points I want to make is that we should not take light the political capital that has been expended on this, and also the amount of will, people's willingness to do this, that has a cost. And we need to basically make the most use of this and the most expedient and most proficient and basically manner in order to maximize Taiwan's military power and deterrence. Now, I want to stress that basically it's not just a show. It's not a show of Taiwan. It's not just a show of Taiwan's willingness. This has to amount to something. It is a very important political decision, but the devil's always in the details. How do we actually transform our reserve forces, transform the conscripts into, I'm not going to say a fighting force. We need to be realistic. We need to understand what we can actually provide them. We need people's buy-in. I think honesty is the best policy. That's the difference between a democratic country and an authoritarian one. Like Ukraine, you can see basically it took a war for the Russians to get into a war before they understand, oh wait, our military doesn't really work. A democratic country is supposed to be able to do better. You communicate with your conscripts. What I can actually provide you. This is the level of training given the resource constraint I have. Resource constraint is not just about money. It's about the amount of people, the amount of money, the amount of political capital that we can devote to this particular topic. But we need your help. We understand that we can't give you everything, but this is also your country. You need people's buy-in. You need, just like Ukraine right now, you need people to understand we're doing this for our own country. Right?
Yeah, and from the announcement yesterday, there was obviously the extension of the conscription. Was there anything else that you felt would make a big impact in terms of national security?
As I mentioned before, right, the important thing is not to waste that people's will and energy and desire and hope to contribute. Now, the first thing you could tell them is why this is important. We have many acquisition cases and military reform programs all around, from basically from the jet trainers, from indigenous submarine programs, from reserve reform, now to the resumption of conscription. What we lack is a communication on the priorities of these programs, right? Where's our overall assessment on which program should matter the most? Why do we choose one program over another? Conscription actually, in reality, doesn't actually cost that much more money. when compared to like a tank acquisition or fighter jets. But is it more important or is it less important? How do we basically make the trade-off between people's will, political capital, and monetary resources in order to maximize Taiwan's will to fight, which then translates into deterrent posture against China? Like, we need to have a higher level overall assessment that's well communicated to the people and through the entire political infrastructure as well as the military infrastructure.
So, Wanty, Kitsch mentioned there, obviously, the overall plan, communicating, really harnessing this moment in time. Was there anything for you that stuck out?
Well, obviously lots of details. I think for me, it's mostly, if I had to pick one thing, that would be the sheer political will and resolve that the administration was able to show through that difficult decision. Because obviously we do have an election coming out in Taiwan in about just over a year's time. And with lots of new, younger voters that's expected to join voting for the first time, they also happen to be the kind of voter that will likely be impacted by this new decision to extend military service. So in that sense, I think the government was able to show that they are in a position to take difficult political decisions and that they're willing to expend significant political capital on doing that, to show, obviously, to international friends and partners that Taiwan is taking care of itself, so that because people help those who help themselves, and Taiwan is certainly telling people that they are helping themselves right now.
The opposition is questioning whether there's enough military bases to actually cover the extended training of the conscripts. What do you make of that?
That's certainly a potential concern, but that's the kind of issue that can be addressed, I believe, over time. And if you don't make a start, you will never really address it, right? So in that sense, those are certainly concerns. You need a new manpower, and then you need a facility to make good use and train that manpower. That's certainly true. But I had to start somewhere. I think this decision is a good start.
Kitsch, is there enough time? Basically, this is going to kick in beginning of 2024, so the government does actually have a year to prepare to, make up for the shortfall, like Wanty just mentioned.
I want to stress first, we should not be losing in minutia. There's a lot to talk about, right? There's not enough bunks for the conscripts to sleep. There's not enough shooting ranges. We all know these problems. These problems exist. And that's why I was talking about it's very important for the government to come out to talk to the conscripts, right? We don't have the resources. We're doing everything we can. We're not trying to hide all the problems. We're seeking your help in enhancing your own country's deterrence. We're not trying to pull one over you. We need your help. We're going to make the most effort we can to actually make your experience as fruitful and as useful for you on any future battlefield as possible. Now, but again, in terms of time frame, realistically, there's only so much we can do. And that's why I kept talking about priority. We need to prioritize. For example, what kind of war am I fighting? Do I prioritize rifle shooting over the training and the use of anti-tank weapons? What sort of units are actually tasked for urban warfare or for reserves or on the beach? Are they going to be functioning as garrison units, or are they going to be functioning as specialized anti-tank units, or even other irregular warfare uses? Right? We're not talking about guerrilla. We're talking about irregular warfare. Now, you only have so much time and so much resources to train. But you can actually be honest to the people, this is what we can do. This is all we got. But we're not trying to pull one over you, and we're seeking your help.
Kitsch spoke about communication being very vital. We talked about also democracy. Let's move now to the comparison with Ukraine. The significance of Ukraine, and we heard there from Volodymyr Zelenskyy addressing US Congress, Wanty, has been framed as a battle between democracy and autocracy. And of course, Taiwan is part of that narrative. Zelenskyy there said, addressing US Congress, saying your money is an investment in democracy and it's not charity. And Taiwan's president too, Taiwan's president too also said, as long as Taiwan is strong enough, it will be the home of democracy and freedom all over the world, and it will not become a battlefield. How would democratic Taiwan, controlled by authoritarian China, how would this impact democracy or the United States?
I think the most natural first change that will bring about is the loss of First Island chain, of course. That's a geostrategic argument. whereby if PRC was able to control Taiwan, then you would see a much more ocean-going PRC Navy that's able to project power into farther corner of the world. And in that basis, then challenge US as well as other maritime powers for supremacy over the oceans. I think that's a natural starting point. But also in terms of narrative speaking, Taiwan has a unique place in being the foremost liberal democracy in the Chinese-speaking world. So in that sense, its very survival always presents to PRC and its people another possibility of running your government. Always present itself as the road not taken, so to speak, to quote Robert Frost's poem. So in that sense, I think Taiwan has great value both strategically as well as narrative speaking, and it will no doubt be an important piece of a puzzle in terms of cementing this democracy as a superior form of government narrative.
Now, recently released photos by Getty show how Beijing is building military bases in the South China Sea and at a rate that was unexpected. In an Atlantic Council article, Kira Rudik argues the big lesson of 2022 is that failure to counter international aggression leads to further aggression. So we've got a map here. Rudik says that failure to punish Moscow for its invasion of Georgia, Crimea and Donbass set the stage for Ukraine. So is Taiwan just the front line, and that Beijing's expansionist ambitions extend beyond Taiwan, of course, to Spratly Islands and also Diaoyutai, also known as the Senkakus? Kitsch, let me come to you. Is Taiwan just the first domino? Would it be just the first domino if China attacked and took over Taiwan?
So it's very interesting because if you ask the PRC, whether Taiwan is the first domino, they're going to say no. It has always been their policy to basically segregate Taiwan problem, the Taiwan issue, from any other ambitions they have around the world. But that's not true. And that's why we actually have to be here. We have to make it very clear. Yes, there's a certain degree of uniqueness of how Taiwan actually means for the Communist Party. That's the ruling legitimacy. They can't actually let this go. But to a greater extent, Taiwan is no longer just Taiwan anymore. The fall of Taiwan basically meant that basically it validates Beijing's rhetoric that the world basically runs on a realist model, realist geopolitical model, that democracy doesn't matter, it's a matter of power projection and geopolitics. Now, this has further implications down the road, right? Because this is what China has been trying to basically convince all the countries in the MENA region and the global south that the US is playing the same game. The Western countries, they really do not care what happens in your country. They only concern themselves with realist concerns, where I can actually provide a better alternative because I'm not as powerful. I will try harder. So we need to actually get the message out that it's not just that. It's about democracy, and also it's about the utility the democracy could provide to your governance. As I talked about before, it has implications not just for governance, not just a value proposition, but also that in terms of basically shoring up your defense, hard strength, right, military. It also can contribute.
Okay, thank you. Still to come in the show, why it's misleading to use history to justify the future.
There's nothing that says once you are part of one sovereign state, that must be how it is forever. And indeed, one of the reasons we don't look back and overturn treaties which were affecting sovereignty and which were the result of war and coercion is because we can't read today's rules back into those earlier times.
But first, US Congress passed America's annual defense bill known as the National Defense Authorization Act on December 8th. But for Taiwan, up to $10 billion in military aid approved in the Taiwan Enhanced Resilience Act and folded into the NDAA was switched to loans. This report by Rick Liao and Kamashu.
Speaking highly of an important ally. This week, Taiwan reiterated the close bond between the island nation and the United States. Relations between the two countries have grown closer in the face of increasing hostility from neighboring China.
第一个，拜登政府对台湾的安全承诺，仍然坚若磐石。拜登政府在过去1年之内7度宣布对台军售，落实军售常态化。那军售的价值 约总共有28亿6600万美元。
But this week saw the crucial friendship hit a rocky patch when promises of a military spending grant failed to materialize. It was hoped that the US would provide funds to help Taiwan deter an attack from China, which claims the country as its own and has upped threats to take by force. When the US passed its 2023 Defense Authorization Act earlier this month, it included a significant grant for Taiwan. They voted on spending $2 billion towards bolstering Taiwan's defensive capabilities, an amount that would be renewed annually over the next 5 years. But a vote in Congress earlier this week reversed the suggestion of giving Taiwan money and decided that the grants should be changed to loans. Taiwan's foreign ministry said it would continue the conversation with its US counterparts. US lawmakers backing the grants claimed the Biden administration had not prioritized Taiwan, and experts say the provisions were a victim of behind-the-scenes political wrangling in Washington.
台湾呢，显然对美国来说重要性还没有高过这两国的，不是说美国故意杀我们，而是他自己内部有困难。我觉得应该这样理解。
As tensions with China rise, both Taiwan and the US continue to tout their rock-solid relationship. But this change in Washington is a reminder that any support is still at the whims of domestic politics. Kamashu and Rick Lowett for Taiwan Plus.
Kitsch, Jim Risch of the US Senate Foreign Affairs Committee described the switch to loans as a loss for Taiwan. What's your view?
I understand Representative Risch's frustration, so to speak. But the other aspect of looking at this is it's actually so much easier to push through loans than grants. Now, we talk about military readiness for Taiwan. Now, the definition of readiness is to have the power you need at the time you need it, right? So if we can push through grants at a smaller amount, which we don't have to repay, it would be meaningless if, let's say, by 2027 there's an invasion and we do not have enough to actually support what we need. The point of a loan is that you could, first of all, it's easier to push through. You could ask for much more. And you can take this loan to show, like the people who's actually giving you this money, that we're actually doing some genuine work that could contribute to Taiwan's deterrence, right? So I would caution against despair. But the other part, this is also for the people who's saying like, this might be enough, is that it is not. We need to actually increase this dramatically as the year goes on, as we push closer toward the 2027 timeline. Because the other thing that people are not talking about is the presidential drawdown authority and the emergency funding authority that the Pentagon has right now. Those authorities would allow the administration to actually directly transfer military equipment and armament from U.S. stockpile, from U.S. militaries, to Taiwan. But of course, the name suggests that basically you do this when there's actually a war. Now, it might be too late. It might actually cost way more money than what the U.S. is willing to grant or loan right now. So that's something to also be put in mind, to keep in mind while we weigh basically how much the U.S. is willing to consider grants for Taiwan, as well as Ukraine. Now, the other point I want to bring up is that, like many other governments, it's not just the U.S. government. All governments have this tendency to privilege the present over the future. And that is a very dangerous tendency. Yes, Ukraine has everybody's attention right now, and rightfully so. They are in the war for their lives. But as a superpower, as the arguably only remaining superpower in the world, the U.S. basically has the authority and has the need to consider future stability. And this should not come at the expense of present crisis.
Wen-Ti, should U.S. be doing more to future-proof?
Well, if you ask it like that, obviously the answer is yes. I'll add, however, onto Kitsch's point, all of which I agree strongly. And I think that for Taiwan, even if it's changed from a grant to a loan, Taiwan is still number one, still very thankful, regardless of whether it's a loan or grant or subsidy or whatever form it takes. I think it's a sign of strong U.S.-Taiwan ties, number one, and the fact that it passed on a largely bipartisan basis, again, is a testament to that as well. And when it comes to loans or grants giving, I think there's always gonna be an issue of unlimited wants but limited resources. So you always triage, you prioritize them by importance versus urgency. At this point, Taiwan is trying to be an understanding and considerate friend to the US and the West. And at the moment, while Taiwan is certainly very important, the situation in Ukraine is both important and urgent. So I think it's probably the right move for Taiwan government as well to acknowledge how while there are wars going on in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, Taiwan is happy to take whatever gesture of goodwill that U.S. is giving it, and that the Taiwan's relative lack of urgency at the moment, at least compared to Ukraine, does not diminish Taiwan's importance or perceived importance in the U.S. and other places around the world.
Kitsch, would you agree with that? The importance of Taiwan has not been diminished.
Yes, definitely, and I would just like to add on the point, add on Wen Ti's point. Actually, it's talking about just like what I was talking about before, in terms of priority, right? In terms of political capital, we must take all our resources, combine all our resources, and in order to maximize, the amount of deterrence that we can provide. Now, this includes also political capital. We're talking about political capital and goodwill within the U.S. administration, as well as on the parliament side, on the Congress side. Now, if we push for everything we got, now this is clearly not Taiwan's business, but we do have certain, inputs on the process. We might be able to get, let's say, $15 million on the grant. But was it worth it? Is it worth it to actually burn all our bridges, so to speak, to get free money? Is that really what we want? This is a resources that needs to be very carefully shepherded and expended in order to actually gain Taiwan the maximum amount of goodwill and deterrence and support from the United States.
Yeah, so it's a relationship building as well, exercise. Wen Ti, let's move now to how much Taiwan is spending. Let's quickly look at Taiwan's GDP. Spending versus GDP. So we're around about 2.4% after a 13% jump in the defense bill for 2023. Let's compare perhaps with a place like Israel or Ukraine, where they are spending actually a lot more. Obviously, Ukraine, we're talking about pre-war, they were also spending more than that. Do you think Taiwan is spending enough? Is it moving quickly enough?
I think there's always room for improvement for Taiwan, and I think the voters are increasingly coming around to accept this urgency as well. And certainly in the aftermath of Ukraine crisis, I always used to say that Taiwan has been living under the threat of existential war for at least a quarter century, if not 70+ years. So it's kind of natural that at some point people need to not completely tune out per se, but not to take every single Chinese provocation at face value. But the Ukraine crisis has certainly brought home to Taiwanese voters this idea, this image of war in such a visual way that's played on the airwaves 24/7 for months on end. So I think right now there's increasing consensus within Taiwan societies for greater defense spending down the road, as well as greater commitment to do their fair share, indeed more than their fair share, if you will, to boost their own defense for itself, but also for, again, other democracy and like-minded countries around the world as well.
Kitsch, just finally on the last question, very quickly, you mentioned political capital and the importance of this. Now, Zelensky's speech to the US Congress, the very latest speech, in person, widely seen as cementing his position as the modern day Winston Churchill, and we know that over the past sort of 10 months, this has been incredible in terms of, getting that support, that commitment for Ukraine. How important would this be as a consideration, do you think, as a factor for Taiwan as we go into the 2024 presidential election?
I would say, I give Zelenskyy all the credit in the world for basically, being able to actually, being able to iterate his country's position in such an elegant and eloquent manner. But we should not overlook the fact that he was able to actually make his government in such a flexible manner, so that the military power and the communication manifested from this flexible governmental organization has done such a great job that Ukraine was able to actually throw off a country have the 10 times the resources they have. Now, that's actually a pivot to the point that Wendy was talking about in terms of our defense budget. I always believe that it's efficiency over quantity. You need to be able to spend the money you have in an efficient manner to maximize the manifest military power in order to construct the maximum amount of deterrence you can offer. Before we actually talk about how much money we want to increase, right? Because every country got a different economic structure. And so it is relatively unfeasible to actually compare a country in this manner.
Thank you so much. We'll have to end it there. Thank you, Kitsch Liao and Won-Ti Sung, for joining us today on Taiwan Talks. Now, finally, a question that arises around Taiwan is whether Taiwan is a country, despite the island nation being self-ruled for more than 70 years. Now, in our extended interview for today's show, I put the question to Jacques Delisle, an expert in law, Taiwan's international status and cross-strait relations. Jacques is University of Pennsylvania's Stephen A. Cousin Professor of Law and Political Science Professor. He is also the University Center for the Study of Contemporary China Director and its Center for Asian Law Co-Director. Jacques is also currently the Asia Program Director at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He explains why Beijing's objective is to convince the world Taiwan is currently part of China. Let's take a look.
Jacques, legally speaking, is Taiwan a country?
Well, that's a tougher question than it sounds like. Taiwan has a good case for satisfying the criteria for statehood, for being a country under international law. The classic standards are that there be a distinct population, a distinct territory, that within that territory and among those people, it's self-governing in the sense of not being a component government in a larger state. And that it has the capacity to engage in international relations. That last prong is sort of the stickiest because, of course, Taiwan has relatively limited formal diplomatic ties with the governments of other states, but it has a very robust international presence. It's got informal representation in many countries around the world. It's a member of many important international organizations, and it has a degree of participation in others. The other piece that arguably is a weak point is that many contested states, disputed states, very openly declare we are a state. They have the equivalent of the American July 4th, 1776 moment. Taiwan hasn't done that, but what Taiwan has done increasingly, or Taiwanese leaders have done increasingly over the last few decades, is to insist increasingly strongly that Taiwan, or the Republic of China on Taiwan, is a sovereign independent state without sort of declaring the moment about when that occurred.
And you talked about the diplomatic allies. So this would explain why China obviously has been trying to poach those allies from Taiwan.
Yes, that's right. And we've seen a gradual erosion of the number of states that maintain formal diplomatic ties with the Republic of China versus the People's Republic. That's been shifting steadily since the 1970s. And since 2016, China has resumed poaching those diplomatic allies so that Taiwan is now down to the very low double digits. But it's not at all clear that you need formal diplomatic recognition to meet the criterion of engaging in international relations. There's a quite strong argument that informal participation will do.
A key component of China's argument to take Taiwan is that Taiwan has always been a part of China and it's an inseparable part.
Well, of course, many in Taiwan would dispute that Taiwan was ever part of China. So you get the argument from some Taiwanese that it never really was, or that at least it has not been for a very long time. It was never more than lightly ruled. And you can look through the history of Portuguese, Dutch, and Japanese presence, particularly Japanese colonialism from 1895 to 1945. You can look back to the time of Kashinga or Zhengchenggong, which was separately ruled, and all of that sort of pushes back against the Chinese claim. But China makes several different claims. Beijing makes several different claims to the effect of Taiwan being part of China, and you just point to the strongest of them, or at least the most assertive of them, not the most credible, but the most assertive, which says that Taiwan is an inalienable part of China and has always been part of China. Now that requires looking away from much of the history that I just mentioned. It also, in particular, requires rejecting some of the events that would have seemed to have separated Taiwan from China if it ever was part of China. So in the mainland view, the 1895 treaty with Japan, which handed Taiwan over to Japan, made it a Japanese colony, was an unequal treaty. It was void from the beginning. And these days, we would object to treaties that transfer territory and sovereignty through coercion, because of a war. But that wasn't the rule back in the 19th century. It was okay to do that. The other argument that China makes about how that treaty could have made no difference is that it's an unequal treaty in the sense that it was substantively unfair to China. It violated Chinese sovereignty. And so if you take this view, for the Chinese view that says Taiwan was an inalienable part of China that never left, then that treaty made no difference, and nothing that happened since, including 75 years, the most recent 75 years or so of separate rule, the period of Japanese colonialism before that, in the Chinese view, none of that can change some unbreakable reality that Taiwan always has been, always must be, and can never not be part of China. That's a pretty hard argument to make under conventional international legal thinking.
There are, plenty of examples of other countries where this has been the case.
There are, of course, many cases where we've rearranged sovereignty. It happens a lot in modern European history. We had the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It broke up. Austrians and Germans have a lot in common. They were once under one sovereignty, then they weren't. Americans, Canadians, Brits obviously have historical ties and were at one point all under one sovereignty, but now they are separate countries. There's nothing that says once you are part of one sovereign state, that must be how it is forever. And indeed, one of the reasons we don't look back and overturn treaties which were affecting sovereignty and which were the result of war and coercion is because we can't read today's rules back into those earlier times, or we'd wind up just jumbling borders, moving people around in ways that are just too destabilizing.
Taiwan has been ruled independently, self-governed for 75 years, as you said. Previous to that, it was a colony of Japan, formerly. So if there had been loose form of imperial Chinese presence on the island before that, does that give China the basis to threaten to annex Taiwan?
Well, no, those kinds of historical ties, if you do not accept that Taiwan is currently part of China and is trying to secede, trying to get away, if you don't grant that premise, that's the PRC premise, the premise from Beijing, certainly not the premise from Taiwan. But if you don't accept that it would be an attempted secession, then it doesn't create a basis. It would, in fact, be taking over a separate entity. It would be a violation of the rules concerning use of force to affect territorial change. So, I mean, it really depends on how you phrase this thing.
And the CCP often cites the fact that there are very strong cultural ties between the Chinese and the Taiwanese as another piece of the argument to say that Taiwan is part of China. What do you make of that?
Well, again, the fact that two groups of people have significant ethnic, linguistic, cultural, historical ties does not mean that they must be part of the same state. It may make it more feasible, more appealing that they are, but it's certainly not required.